Well, hello, everybody. It's great to be here with you tonight. My name is Denny Patton. I am the founder and the president of Silver Ring Thing, and I'm just thrilled that so many of you decided to show up tonight to do what we're going to do tonight for kids when it comes to their purity, their sexual health. I have one wife. Her name is Amy, and three daughters. Logan is my oldest daughter, Jessica, and Casey. They all put on the silver ring when they were 12 years old, and they're still wearing it. And they've graduated from college now and hopefully finding a husband. And my wife wants grandchildren. That's all I keep hearing about. I said, be careful what you wish for. So tonight we're going to talk about some things about what's going on in the youth culture that I know you're not aware of because I talk to parents all the time. Let me share a quick survey that comes from the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. They do a survey every year. I'm going to show you two questions that they ask. The first question is, who teens say most influence their decisions about sex? Their answer is, my parents. But yet when parents are asked the same question, who influences your teen's decision most about sex? We say it's their friends. And right off the bat, I want you to understand, we're upside down. See, when taking a survey, when people are quiet, teenagers say that you and I are their number one influence, not their friends. Now, they're not going to come up to you at home and go, hey, Mom and Dad, keep throwing out that sex stuff. Man, I appreciate it so much. Keep giving me these talks. It's like awesome. I mean, you got it down, man. Keep going for it. They're not going to do that. But in their quietness, it's our values that they really value. Yet research shows that parents have more impact on their child's sexual decision-making than any other influence. But unfortunately, we don't talk to our kids about sex because we're either too busy, too embarrassed, we feel guilty about our own past histories, or we simply feel ill-informed. And that's got to stop. We have to talk to our kids about this. Let's look at something that shows the vulnerability of the teenagers. Basically, when it comes to pregnancy, even though the pregnancy rate is going down, nearly 700,000 teenagers, 15 to 19, get pregnant every year. 80% of those pregnancies were unintended, and 27% of them end in abortion. We also have something we call the hidden epidemic, which is what's happening with the sexually transmitted diseases amongst our young people. For instance, are you aware that we are now dealing with 30 sexually transmitted diseases? In the 1960s, we were dealing with 2, syphilis and gonorrhea. We're now dealing with nearly 30. Here's a statistic that I find parents just can't even get their minds around. Right now in America, there are 65 million Americans who are currently living with an incurable sexually transmitted disease. Did you hear that? 65 million have a disease they got from sex that there is no cure for. That was a statistic that was on the Center for Disease Control's website year 2000. 8.5 million Americans get an incurable sexually transmitted disease every year. Who knows where that number is now? And 80% of these diseases, when you get them, you won't even know you have them. It's called being asymptomatic. You get the disease. You just haven't shown any symptoms yet. No outward symptoms, no pain. But you can pass it on and you can receive it. And our teenagers' bodies are much more susceptible to getting a sexually transmitted disease than our bodies. Our bodies have limited defense mechanisms against these diseases. Our children have next to none. And so they're very, very vulnerable to these diseases. Yet on TV and in the media, all our kids hear about are condoms. Basically, if you use a condom, you'll be safe and you'll be protected. Nothing could be further from the truth. I call it the con in condoms. I've had to research condoms. And basically, I'm going to share with you the 6 most common STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, and how much a condom helps right now, okay? But it's important for you to understand where we're starting. To get the limited protection of a condom, you must do 2 things. You must use it every single time you have sex, and number 2, you must use it perfectly. Now, to use a condom perfectly, I looked this up. There are about 25 things you have to do to use a condom perfectly. Just 25. In a teenager's hands. In the moment. With hormones raging. Okay? But if you can do that, and if you can use it 100% of the time, here are the results for the 6 most common sexually transmitted diseases. Chlamydia and gonorrhea, your risk reduction would be about 50%. Herpes, about 30% risk reduction. HIV/AIDS, about 85% risk reduction. Human papillomavirus, which causes about 95% of all cervical cancer in women, you get about a 70% risk reduction. And syphilis, about 30 to 50% risk reduction. And nearly every one of the 30 sexually transmitted diseases you can get through traditional sex, you can get through oral sex, including these 6. So here's the key point. Used inconsistently, less than 100% of the time, condoms offer a little more protection than if they're not used at all. So our kids are incredibly vulnerable. Trust me, they're incredibly vulnerable. We just don't know about all this. But something came across my desk about 2 years ago that absolutely blew me away. And it's this whole new science about the teenage brain, or in some of our cases, the lack thereof, right? Or so we would think. A few decades ago, most scientists thought that the brain was nearly fully formed by about age 12. But with the invention of the MRI machine and the functional MRI machine, we now see that there's a radically more dynamic growth in the teenage brain than previously thought. Yet the part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind the forehead, which is where we get our responsible thinking, understanding consequences, processing problem solving, it's under heavy construction and much of the time dysfunctional during the teenage years. I'm sure you've wondered why teenagers make such dumb decisions at times, right? I mean, didn't we? Well, let you hear from a doctor, Dr. Frances Jensen, who's a senior assistant in neurology at Boston Children's Hospital. She's also a professor at Harvard University. She explains this very well, so check out this video.
The teenage brain is a late childhood brain. It's not yet a fully mature adult brain. So they're at the end of a childhood pattern of brain physiology, and they're emerging the adult pattern. So they're sort of at the crossroads of these 2 points in development. And as you know, children can learn very quickly. They go through what we call a critical period of synaptic plasticity, where early in childhood, you know, children can learn 2 and 3 languages flawlessly, whereas adults struggle to learn a second language with even getting a mild accent under control. So the teenager is still at that peak learning. They're coming down to adult levels, but they're still more able to, pick things up and memorize and imprint on things than perhaps later in life. Now, the thing is, though, they also haven't acquired a really important feature of the adult brain, which is how the different brain areas really connect to each other. So as we get older, we develop better, stronger connections between our different regions of the brain. And it actually develops from sort of the back of your brain to the front, the connectivity of the brain. And big surprise, the last place to develop to connect is the frontal lobe. So this process is called myelination, which is actually a wrapping of the connections to make them conduct signal faster, so that you connect up parts of your brain faster. It's probably how adults compensate for not having the brilliant learning that children have. So the last place to connect is the frontal lobe. Now we know that the frontal lobe has some very special properties. It's what controls insight, judgment, blocks you from too much risk-taking behavior, and these are all issues with the teenager brain. So teenagers are notorious for risk-taking, poor judgment, not really thinking through things properly, yet they can be very sharp at the same time and be memorizing all sorts of things for the SATs and all these standardized tests and be whizzing through material, yet they're not showing the judgment. And so that's the paradox, that they are very, very sharp on the one hand with respect to their ability to learn and their physiology that underlies learning, but the connectivity is lagging. They're not there yet. So you have very bright people who may not actually be ready for prime time in terms of their judgment and insight.
So as you can see, there's much going on in these teenagers' brains. They're still connecting. They're building stronger and more secure connections during the adolescent years. But because this connectivity is lagging, teenagers don't always think things through, do they? And often, they're lacking in insight and judgment. You know, it's the line that we ask all of our kids when they really mess up. We all say the same thing, don't we? What were you thinking? And their answer is always the same. I don't know. They can't even form words, right? Now they're actually, you're right, that we can understand it. Let me talk about just two regions of the brain that I think help us understand this. First is something called the amygdala. It's a walnut-sized shaped part of our brain. It's in the back middle part of our brain. This is where we do most of our emotional thinking, kind of the gut level. For most people, this is fully developed by about age 13. But the prefrontal cortex, where we kind of call it our CEO part of our brain, where we have insight and judgment, that doesn't form, now we're learning, till about age 25 or 30. Now, why is that important? Well, let me show you a couple pictures of why. In this first picture, you'll see a brain of a 12-year-old, and we're basically looking for the dark purple color in the forehead. It's obviously not developed, and even just slightly more developed by age 16. And even at age 20, it's not fully developed. This has huge impacts on how a kid thinks things through, and they're not able to do that. Let me show you another picture. This is a face that everybody was asked to look at. In the volunteers, they were put into an MRI machine, adults and teenagers. They asked what emotion is on this person's face, and they saw other faces along with this one. 100% of the parents, adults, said that is fear. But yet 50% of the teenagers said fear, and the other 50% said shock or anger. Now, why is there this difference, you see? Well, the next picture will show you. See, the brain on the right is in the middle is the amygdala, and that's where when they saw the action in the teenager's brain, that's where it lit up, in the amygdala. Or in other words, they looked at that face and in their emotional part of the brain made a decision. Yet the brain on the left, when you look at it, the parents were thinking it through in their prefrontal cortex and connecting it through their limbic region, through the emotional part of their brain. So teens process the information at the gut level, more emotional, and parents, on the other hand, are using reasoning and emotion. This is very real and new science. So this helps us understand why teens think things through so much differently than we do. They have an immature brain, and where they process the information is different than where we process it. I asked a doctor friend of mine to explain this to me in a word picture, because I told him I talk to parents all the time. He said, here's the word picture. The gas pedal of the car in a teenage brain is on the floor. The emotional part of their brain is on the floor. And they're tapping the logic brake throughout adolescence. Sound like anybody you know? Sound like the way you were when you were a teenager, right? That's what's actually happening. If you look at these next couple of pictures, this will explain part of the process of how this works. When we're learning something new, our brain cells called neurons reach out and they connect to form networks. As we practice and focus on specific things, these networks get stronger. These pathways that connect the most get coated. They get insulated with something called myelin, which allows the signals to go quicker and more efficiently. And why is this important? Well, let me show you the next picture. There's a process in the teenage brain called the use it or lose it process. During adolescence, these junctions, called synapses in the brain, that are not getting used get pruned and discarded. You can see the X there. Get pruned and discarded, while the junctions that are used the most become stronger. And just as important, the frequently used connections are the ones that get wrapped and insulated in myelin. And also important is the pruning and myelination process occurring during adolescence will have long-term consequences on the strengthening or the weakening of the connectivity of the brain. This is what's going on. So at puberty, teenagers end up with more gray matter, the nerve cells that let us think, than they will ever have again in their lives. Then comes this time of rapid pruning back and discarding of the unwanted parts that they're not using. It's almost like a carver who's making a piece of art out of a block of wood. He starts chipping away the wood, right? And he discards that wood because it's not useful. And he has a real nice piece of art at the end of the day. He has less wood, but it's a better finished product. And that's what's happening in the brain. So if you want your child to be a star volleyball player, or you want them to be a rock star, or you want them to be a language whiz, then start practicing and get working on this early, because this is where the connectivity is going to happen, or it may never happen for them. And by the way, the more you practice something and the harder you practice something, the thicker the myelin around the connections and the faster the ability to think. So they had an example of a piano player who practiced, and they looked at the myelin around her connection. It was thicker than other examples of that. So this really inspired me. I've been doing youth ministry for 35 years, and I just couldn't believe this information, because this really explains so many things to me. Helped me understand my own children, helped me understand the kids I was working with. But most importantly, it got me to think about faith. If it's true that what we practice is getting connected and wrapped and myelinized, then it's also true that when we look at faith, that also can get wrapped and insulated and connected during the adolescent years. It's absolutely critical that we help kids learn and understand what it means to be a Christian, and to inspire them. Think about this. If a kid is actively involved in a youth ministry, if a kid is actively involved pursuing his faith, he comes from a faith-built family. Those are the connections that are going to be made. Those are the ones that are going to get coated and insulated in myelin. Those are the ones that are going to have the lasting effect. And if you don't, those are the connections that will be discarded and not grow. It's funny how science is always catching up with Scripture. Let me share a couple verses with you. First one is Proverbs 22, verse 6. It says this. Listen to this. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. How about that? And how about Colossians 3, verse 21? Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. That's right. If we're pushing our kids through things that their brains can't keep up with, they are going to become discouraged. But we don't understand how they can't think like us. That's the problem. Part of the connecting process in the brain that we've been talking about is the structure. There's also a chemical process. When these connections are trying to be made, there's neurochemicals that are released in the brain to complete the connections, okay? And this comes into very important focus for us because we're talking about sex now, or we're talking about alcohol and drugs. And see, the important part here is that when we get stimulated sexually, our brains are flooded with neurochemicals, and they cause all kinds of problems. So I'm going to let Dr. McElhenney, a friend of mine, who started the Medical Institute for Sexual Health and wrote the book Hooked, which we have a copy of here tonight, explain the brain chemical part. Here's Dr. McElhenney.
Imagine if science could prove sleeping around in your youth could ruin your chances of having a happy, fulfilling marriage later. That's what Dr. Joe McElhenney of the Medical Institute for Sexual Health in Austin says new research shows.
Neuroscientists have produced a lot of information just in the past few years. This is new.
And he reveals in the book, Hooked,
The most modern neuroscience available to man today.
Research using brain scans now shows powerful chemicals are released during sex that should create a powerful, everlasting bond. For women,
their brain secretes oxytocin that causes them to bond emotionally to that man. Men secrete a hormone called vasopressin when they're having that kind of intimate behavior, and it bonds them to the woman.
This oxytocin is so overwhelming in a woman's brain that just a 20-second hug can cause a female to become bonded to a male, a 20-second hug. Both sexes get addictive doses of dopamine as well during intimate behavior, which does work well for couples out to create lifelong marriages and stable families.
They're addicted to sex, and babies result from that.
But that bonding, which acts like adhesive tape or Velcro, is weakened when people tear away at its power by breaking off with a sexual partner and moving on from one to another to another. So when it does finally come time to bond permanently with a spouse, the ability to bond is damaged.
The brain actually gets molded to not accept that deep emotional level that's so important for marriage.
One huge result of this for the permissive?
When they do marry, they're more likely to have a divorce than people that were virgins when they got married.
So as we can see, and as we see in these MRI machines, when a teenager's brain is stimulated, it's flooded with dopamine, which we call the reward chemical. Dopamine makes us want more. This is what leads to addiction when we talk about drugs and alcohol. We flood the brain with dopamine. But he also talked about oxytocin and vasopressin. They are the binding chemicals in our brain. So as God created us, he created these bonding chemicals meant for a marriage between a man and a woman to stay together. But when you have sex outside of marriage, the same binding thing is going on because these chemicals are values neutral. They don't know the difference. And so this is now helping us understand why so many people are struggling in their marriages to feel bonded, because their brains have been wired to think sex is experienced in a different way because they literally connected that way and it got wrapped and myelinized. That, to me, is a really tragic part of what's going on with the hookup generation that we see today. Well, let's talk about why teenagers are so vulnerable, especially to what we're now calling the new drug, pornography. Pornography is now being known as the new drug. Why? Because we got little porn machines called smartphones right in our pockets, and kids are struggling. So you don't have to go looking for porn. Porn will find you. And now we're realizing, and this is new because people didn't think you could get addicted to sex, we're now finding out you can. Check out this video by Dr. Gordon Bruin, who's a psychologist, who really has studied addiction and really can point this out better than I can. Check out Dr. Bruin.
When one views pornography, there are a whole cocktail of pleasurable chemicals released in the limbic regions of the brain, such as dopamine, norepinephrine, oxytocin, and serotonin bind the brain to seek certain behaviors that will produce a euphoric feeling state. Please understand that this is how it works. If a fleeting thought enters a person's mind, and all relapses follow this certain pattern. There's a fleeting thought, mental attention, making plans, acting out, and guilt and remorse that follows. Part of what we teach in recovery is teaching people the concepts of acceptance and surrender. We are not accountable for the thoughts that pop into our minds. That is a very frustrating concept for many who struggle with this addiction. They feel that they are bad because they have a thought pop into their mind. The portion of the brain where these thoughts come from is not under the direct control of the will. This is how the chemical reaction happens. A person has a fleeting thought of a sexual image, or they see something online or on TV. If they give that thought enough attention, dopamine is released in the brain, originating from the limbic system. If the thought is held for just a few microseconds too long, norepinephrine is released in the brain. Norepinephrine is associated with memories, and so it hooks to the memories of something that created pleasure, and then it just creates this drive and craving to follow through with the activity. And then if a person actually reaches the point of acting out, oxytocin is released. Now, oxytocin is what's known as the binding chemical. When a mother has a baby and they're holding the child in their arms, this is the chemical that's released to bind the mother and the child together. In males, there's a very similar chemical. And then after the acting out happens, and serotonin, which is our basic natural Prozac that we all naturally have in our brain, comes on, and we just have this kind of down, relaxing feeling afterwards. It's just to understand that, especially when this process is repeated over and over and oxytocin is released, people actually become bound to the computer, bound to the images online, that it becomes a part of their life. And what the limbic system does, the primitive part of the brain, it's a survival thing. It's just the greatest illusion that we function with in our culture right now, that pornography isn't addictive. The problem is that it's hitting our growing generation in a way that we just don't know what the outcome is going to be down the road, and so we really have to get some information out there and put some things in place to help people become more educated, that it's not just a simple little thing that your 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old comes across pornography. It needs to be talked about, it needs to be processed, and not left inside the individual themselves, because that's where problems and the addiction can begin to take off. So scientific evidence now strongly supports an organic basis for all addiction. Neuroscience has shown that all addictions, both drug and natural, are caused by a deficit of dopamine in the reward system. This deficit produces a very powerful craving which underlies all addiction.
Okay, well, I don't know if that scared you, but it scared me to see how addictive pornography can really be. Let me summarize a few things for us. A surge of hormone at puberty makes teenagers more emotionally reactive. The brain reward centers are also more active during adolescence, driving them to seek new sensations. They become more interested in doing risky things. Experimenting with drugs, sex, and alcohol are very tempting to a teenager. But with the brain still developing, this can have very serious consequences. And the younger they start these behaviors, the worse it is for the brains and the more likely it is for them to become addicted. Let me show you one last picture tonight that really makes this make sense. How does pornography lead to addiction? Porn goes into the eyes and triggers the release of chemicals in the brain. When you do drugs or look at porn, your brain is overloaded with these chemicals. After you keep looking at porn for a while, the brain gets used to these high amounts of chemicals and you build up a tolerance. In order to keep up the rush, you need more and a harder core version of porn. The brain becomes dependent upon the rush of chemicals. Your brain literally rewires itself to think that this is normal. Then you discover that you cannot function without it. This is addiction, and you cannot stop. The sexual stimulation pours these chemicals into our brains, and especially dopamine. It makes us want more, and habits form. But in a teenage brain, as I just described it, that is so immature, who think through the limbic region and the emotional part of the brain with an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, do you see the disaster? And this is happening all the time. Porn is finding our kids. They now have these porn machines in their pocket called smartphones. And we have to manage them. So what are we going to do about this? How are we going to deal with this? Well, let's first look at what God says through his scripture. And I found a very powerful verse. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. Here's what Paul says. We demolish arguments and every pretense that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. As a Christian, we have to demolish the arguments of our world. We have to fight those arguments. Look at what we're doing here tonight with these kids. And we take them captive under the obedience of Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. Powerful, powerful thought. So what are we going to do moving forward? Okay? First of all, parents, here's an idea I have for you, okay? You know those jumper cables you use when your battery is drained and you put it on somebody else's battery? We need to jumper cable our brains to our teenagers' brains. They need to use our logical part of our brain during the adolescent years, even into young adulthood. They need our help. Please get that point tonight. Think of jumper cables. Just think about it. You don't leave them on all the time, do you? But you pick the times when the other battery isn't working well. Don't forget that. Number 2, they need a ton of adults in their lives that care about them. I had a guy come into my life when I was 18, and he shared Christ with me. He shared faith with me. You see, both of my parents are atheists. My father died an atheist, and my mother still is an atheist. But yet this man came in and shared how Christ could transform my life, and he did. And it's the only reason I'm speaking to you today. Number 3, youth pastors. I'm a career youth pastor. I believe in youth ministry. If a church doesn't have a good youth program, I feel sorry for that church. Churches need to have the best youth programs because of what we just talked about. The teenage brain, the formation of faith. Did you know that 85% of all commitments made to Christ occur before the age of 18? In other words, when somebody gets out of high school, there's about a 15% chance that they're going to find Christ, statistically. We need youth pastors. We need youth programs in churches. We need to pay for it because of what I've just described to you. It's critical, critical stuff. And that's just on the spiritual stuff without the science. The science just adds to it. And finally, the social media. Number 4, the social media and the internet, especially smartphones. We need to really be on top of this. Do not ever think you've got this covered. I get too many emails. I get too many text messages back. I talk to too many parents. Stay on top of the electronic media. It's critical. I like to talk about something called recoverable Christians. When I talk to my wife and we talk about our 3 daughters, the question I always want to ask is, how do we know if they're really over the edge as a Christian? How do we know they're really there? You may ask that question about your own children. It's what I call being a recoverable Christian. When my daughters sin, and they are going to sin, and nobody else knows about it but God, they recover. They repent. They get back on their game. And what we need to do in our families is create these recoverable Christians. Well, let me give you 7 things, and it's actually on your brochure there, 7 things that I want you to look at, think about tonight when you go home. These should be some helpful, practical ideas, okay? Number 1, talk to your children early and often about sex and be specific. Listen, you need to talk to your kids about sex, especially what I just said about the brain. And you got to be specific. And if you don't think you do, think about this. If you don't talk to your kids about sex, somebody will take care of that for you. Okay? Number 2, fully support your child's decision to wait from an early age. Maybe you've got teenagers tonight, but maybe you have younger kids at home. Get started early about your values for them and start talking about it early so that when they get into puberty and other things, they're more ready for it. Remember, they're going to struggle thinking it through. Number 3, supervise and monitor your kids. Set good curfews, one-on-one dating ages and standards. Know what they are watching, reading, and listening to, especially their social media and network devices. Yes, you are allowed to creep on their sites, okay? So creep away, all right? And know your children's friends and families. How often have we seen kids that were raised in a great Christian family go down because they got in with the wrong friends or the wrong family? Stay on top of that. Stay on top of that. That's all I can say. Number 4, be clear about your own sexual values and attitudes. I have parents say to me, you know, I feel like a hypocrite telling my kid to wait. I didn't do so well on this subject. I said, really? Well, let me give you an anonymous quote. If you tell your kids what not to do and you're doing it, you're right. You are a hypocrite. But if you tell your kids what not to do because you used to do it, you're a parent. Isn't that what parents do? We tell our kids what hurt us the most and tell them not to do it. We stop doing it. We're delivering the truth. Don't ever hold back delivering the truth. Yes, we're sinners, but your kids already know you're not perfect. Don't ever hold back. Don't ever feel guilty about telling them the truth. Live it out as best you can, but don't hold back. Number 5, meet the person your child is dating. Discourage early, frequent, and dating someone significantly older. You may have different dating policies across this room. I understand that. But I can tell you one thing. If your kid is dating somebody significantly older, good luck. And if you want to know more about that, email me and I'll send you 1,000 emails I've got back from kids who were just great, innocent kids. Next thing they had sex. And guess who it was with? Someone significantly older. That, to me, is a big one to fight. Number 6, open up your home. Set values. Build on biblical principles. Do you know our home is our greatest weapon? And all you need to do is to have food. If you have food, they will come. I guarantee you. It doesn't even have to be good food. Put out your stale stuff. They'll eat it. They're nervous. They're not paying attention. Don't feel guilty about throwing out your flat Coke. Give it to them. They'll drink it. They don't care. They're just there to hang out. But seriously, My wife Amy bakes chocolate chip cookies, and they are ridiculously good. People come, they put in orders. Hey, Ames, I'm coming over your house. Could you make some cookies? Yeah, we do. And we're the no sex house in the neighborhood, right? They know what I do. They still come. Why? Because we got something they can't find anywhere else. We have values, man. We know how to love on people, and we're pretty good at hanging out. We're crazy, actually. Lamps get knocked over, all kinds of stuff. A little bit maybe illegal at times, but we have good times at our house, right? They keep coming, and I'm telling you, I appreciate that, and we pass our values on. And number 7, I want you tonight, now listen to this, I want you to seriously consider putting on a ring yourself. Now don't go home and tell your husband or wife you've decided to be abstinent. I'm not talking about that, okay? Don't get me killed, all right? I've been wearing this ring, this silver ring above my wedding ring for 14 years now. And I wear it for 3 reasons. Here they are. Number 1, to be a constant reminder, to remind me every day to pray for my 3 daughters. Now, if you heard nothing else tonight, and you do just that, no matter what condition your kid is in, it's the best thing I had to say tonight. God will hear this prayer. He gave you the child. You give him back to him and let him take care of some of the issues you're facing. Pray every day for your child. Number 2, pray for their future spouse every day. That kid may never get prayed for. And he's coming to your house on the holidays to wreck your holidays. Pray for him now. Don't wait for that. Pray now. And number 3, pray for your own purity. Because we still get tempted, right? We still have stuff come after us. Pray for your own purity. I cannot think of something more valuable to share with you tonight than to just do something that simple. Put it on. Join your kids. Lead your kids in this. And you can get rings outside after the show tonight if you want one. There's some references on the materials we hand out to you that are very valuable. I hope you check those out, because if you're struggling in any of those areas, you'll be able to refer back to them. I want to end tonight with a verse. It's the actual reference verse on the ring. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. And I'm going to add 2 more verses to it, verse 7 and 8. Listen to these verses. First of all, the 2 verses on the ring. It is God's will that you be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable. For God did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life. Therefore, anyone who rejects this instruction does not reject a human being, but God, the very God, who gives you his Holy Spirit. So God's just laid out a pretty high standard. It's his will that you be sanctified, that you be holy. Last verse, who gives you his Holy Spirit. See, God calls us up here, but empowers us right here in our soul. When you have the Holy Spirit, you have supernatural wisdom, power. You have supernatural strength to pull stuff off as the brain is developing. So I hope that was helpful. Thanks for coming tonight. Thanks for being so supportive of your kids, and God bless you guys.